I've learned that the fastest way to lose $3 million isn't making a bad investment. It's pretending you know more about a road than the engineers who built it. The smell of hot asphalt hit me before I even turned off my truck, thick enough to coat the back of my throat as dawn settled over Cedar Hollow. Orange warning lights flashed through the morning mist, and the steady clank of an excavator echoed across the valley where my family's gravel road had quietly served ranchers, delivery trucks, and school buses for nearly 70 years. I eased my Ford F-250 onto the shoulder and stepped out into air carrying the scent of diesel exhaust, wet clay, and freshly torn earth. A yellow bulldozer sat where my grandfather's original stone culvert had been only 48 hours earlier. Broken limestone lined both sides of the trench like scattered bones from an old foundation, while workers rolled fresh blacktop over soil that was never supposed to support pavement. Then I saw her. Miranda Holloway stood beside a white luxury SUV wearing pressed khakis and a bright blue blazer, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. She smiled before I even reached the barricade. "Morning, Cole," she called, cheerful enough to make the whole scene feel rehearsed. "You'll be happy to know the HOA decided your old road needed an upgrade." I looked past her toward the exposed drainage pipe that had carried runoff beneath that crossing since 1958. The pipe wasn't simply old infrastructure. My grandfather had helped design it alongside county engineers after 2 devastating spring floods washed out half the valley. Every inch of that crossing had a purpose, even if most people only saw gravel and weeds. I asked one simple question: who approved tearing it apart? Miranda shrugged with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. The board voted unanimously. Property values will benefit, and once your share of the reconstruction costs is paid, everyone wins. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I crouched beside the trench and picked up a chunk of broken concrete still damp from the night's rain. Embedded in its edge was a faded state inspection stamp that most people would never notice. I brushed away the mud with my thumb and quietly set it back where I found it. Behind me, one of the equipment operators asked whether they should keep digging. Miranda answered before I could speak. "Finish the job." The excavator roared back to life. Steel teeth bit into the embankment, and another section of the drainage channel collapsed into the bucket. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't even ask them to stop again. I simply walked back to my truck, opened the passenger door, and pulled out a weathered leather folder that had ridden beside me for 15 years on bridge inspections, flood assessments, and emergency response calls across the state. Inside were survey maps, maintenance records, easement documents, and engineering drawings older than the HOA itself. Miranda watched me flip through the pages and laughed softly. "Planning to sue us?" she asked. I closed the folder, looked once more at the ruined culvert, and shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm going to let the people who actually own this problem find out what you just did." Most people think a road begins where the gravel starts. My grandfather used to tell me that a real road begins years before the first truck ever drives across it. It begins with rainwater, soil, and the people wise enough to understand that nature always collects its debt. I could still hear his voice as I drove home that morning, the leather folder resting on the passenger seat while dust from the construction site drifted across my windshield. The tires hummed over the remaining stretch of untouched gravel, and every vibration reminded me that half of the crossing no longer sat at the elevation it had held since President Dwight Eisenhower was in office. My grandfather, Walter Whitaker, bought this ranch in 1956 after returning from military service with little more than determination and a surveyor's transit he picked up at an estate sale. Cedar Hollow looked peaceful, but every spring the runoff rushing down the hills carved trenches through neighboring fields and stranded families for days. Instead of complaining, he spent weekends walking the watershed with county engineers, measuring slopes by hand and marking drainage paths with wooden stakes. 2 years later, they built the stone culvert that everyone in town simply called Whitaker Crossing. The state supplied engineering guidance because the drainage corridor protected a section of highway less than a mile downstream. Grandpa supplied the labor, the rock, and more patience than most people could imagine. My father inherited both the ranch and the responsibility that came with it. Every autumn, he inspected the culvert before the rainy season arrived. Every fallen branch was cleared. Every crack was repaired before it became expensive. By the time I was old enough to carry a shovel, I understood that maintenance was never glamorous. It was simply the reason disasters rarely happened. Maybe that is why I became a civil infrastructure inspector instead of taking over ranching full-time. I spent 22 years examining bridges, retaining walls, drainage systems, and rural roads across the state. Most people never noticed the structures I inspected until something failed. That was exactly how good infrastructure was supposed to work. Quiet, reliable, invisible. When the Willow Creek Estates subdivision appeared 15 years earlier, I welcomed the new neighbors. Families deserved safe homes, children deserved sidewalks, and local businesses benefited from growth. Then the Homeowners Association slowly convinced itself that every improvement required another improvement. Decorative entrances replaced simple signs. Stone monuments replaced practical fences. Perfect appearances became more important than understanding why older systems existed in the first place. Miranda Holloway arrived 5 years ago with polished speeches about modernization and community standards. She talked about curb appeal the way engineers talked about public safety, except she never asked questions before making decisions. If a gravel road looked old, she wanted pavement. If a drainage ditch looked unattractive, she wanted landscaping. Every meeting ended with applause from people who admired the finished picture without ever studying the foundation beneath it. Standing beside my kitchen window. That evening, I watched dark clouds gathering over the western ridge while the smell of approaching rain drifted through the open screen. Somewhere beyond those hills, water was already beginning its slow journey toward a drainage system that no longer matched the plans approved decades earlier. Nature never hurried, but it never forgot its route either. Neither did the records sitting quietly inside the leather folder on my dining room table. The next morning arrived with low gray clouds hanging over Cedar Hollow like a blanket pulled across the sky, and the air carried that unmistakable smell of damp cedar mixed with fresh earth that always appeared a few hours before rain. I poured a cup of black coffee and stepped onto my porch just as the rumble of pickup trucks echoed from the direction of the subdivision. It did not take long before I saw what Miranda had planned next. A convoy of landscaping crews, contractors, and utility trucks rolled straight across what had always been my private access road, as if they had every legal right in the world. New orange traffic barrels lined both sides of the damaged crossing. Fresh signs had appeared overnight. One read, "Future Willow Creek Scenic Boulevard." Another welcomed visitors into the neighborhood with polished stone columns that had never existed before. I stood there for several seconds, watching strangers photograph the entrance while a local real estate agent proudly showed a young couple where the new community boulevard would soon connect. Nobody asked permission because everyone assumed permission had already been granted. That was the dangerous thing about confidence. Once enough people believed it, confidence started looking exactly like authority. Around noon, I drove toward the temporary construction office that the Homeowners Association had set up inside a portable trailer near the subdivision entrance. The smell of new lumber and fresh paint drifted through the open doorway, while cheerful music played from a portable speaker inside. Miranda greeted me with the same polished smile she wore at every monthly meeting, the kind that looked friendly until you noticed it never reached her eyes. She slid a thick folder across the folding table. Inside were glossy renderings showing wide sidewalks, decorative lighting, flower beds, bicycle lanes, and a divided entrance lined with maple trees. At the bottom sat an invoice addressed directly to me. My share of reconstruction costs totaled $148,000, payable within 30 days. Underneath, another paragraph explained that future maintenance assessments would also become my responsibility because the improved roadway would benefit my property. I slowly closed the folder without saying a word. Miranda folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. "You have to admit it will look much better than gravel," she said. "People are already talking about how much this will increase home values." I looked through the trailer window toward the excavator parked beside the broken drainage crossing. "Do you know why that culvert sits exactly where it does?" I asked. She smiled as though I had changed the subject. "Because somebody built it there a long time ago." I nodded once. "Exactly." She laughed softly, convinced she had won another argument. Before I left, one of the contractors stopped me outside and quietly asked whether I really owned the road. I answered honestly, "I own what the deed says I own." He glanced back toward the machines and lowered his voice. "Then I hope they pulled permits." His words lingered in my mind during the drive home. That evening, the first steady rain began tapping against the roof of my barn. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, patient rainfall soaking into ground that had always depended on carefully measured elevations and unobstructed drainage. Through the kitchen window, I watched small streams begin winding down the hillside exactly as they had for decades. The only difference was that now those streams were heading toward a crossing that no longer matched the engineering drawings quietly waiting inside my leather folder. By sunrise, the rain had stopped, leaving Cedar Hollow wrapped in cool fog that clung to the fields while every fence post glistened with tiny drops of water. I grabbed my work boots, a measuring rod, and the same survey maps that had followed me. Through hundreds of state inspections, the gravel crunched beneath my feet as I walked toward the damaged crossing, and before I even reached the culvert, I could hear something that should never have been there. Water. Not rushing, not flooding, just a steady trickle flowing in the wrong direction. That quiet sound bothered me more than any excavator ever could. Water almost always tells the truth before people do. I knelt beside the freshly disturbed soil and watched muddy runoff slipping around the unfinished embankment instead of entering the drainage pipe. The contractor had changed the elevation by only a few inches, but in drainage engineering, a few inches can redirect thousands of gallons during a storm. I extended the measuring rod, checked the grade twice, and wrote the numbers inside my field notebook without saying a word. A white pickup rolled to a stop behind me, and Miranda climbed out wearing spotless boots that had clearly never spent much time in actual mud. She smiled as though she expected me to compliment the project. "Taking measurements already?" she asked. "Trying to figure out how much you owe?" I stood up, brushed the wet dirt from my gloves, and looked toward the damaged culvert. "I am trying to understand why your contractor ignored the original grade." She laughed lightly and motioned toward the newly paved section. "Nobody cares about old gravel elevations anymore, Cole. This is progress." I pointed toward the shallow stream, now creeping across the shoulder instead of flowing beneath it. "Water still cares." She barely glanced at it. "It rained less than an inch." "Exactly," I replied, "and it is already missing the designed flow line." Her expression stayed confident. "Our engineer approved everything." "Did your engineer review the original state drawings?" I asked. She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "We hired professionals." That was not the question I had asked. Before either of us could say another word, one of the construction supervisors walked over holding a rolled blueprint. His face carried the tired look of someone caught between doing his job and wondering whether the paperwork behind it actually existed. Quietly, so Miranda could not hear, he asked whether the old drainage records were available anywhere. I told him they were archived with the state and county. His eyes drifted toward the excavator before he nodded once and walked away without another word. That single conversation told me more than the entire Homeowners Association meeting ever could. Experienced contractors ask about old drawings only when they realize they never received them. As I headed back toward my truck, I stopped beside one of the broken concrete sections removed from the original crossing. Rain had washed away the mud covering its surface overnight. The faded inspection stamp was now perfectly visible, along with an identification number still carved into the concrete after nearly 7 decades. I took several photographs, carefully including the surrounding grade, the exposed drainage channel, and the fresh asphalt sitting several inches above the original elevation. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement, while birds returned to the oak trees lining the ranch. Everything looked peaceful again. That was the strange thing about engineering mistakes. Long before anyone noticed the consequences, they often looked exactly like beautiful improvements. For the next 3 days, I did something that drove Miranda absolutely crazy. I did nothing. At least that was what everyone believed. Every morning, I drove to my regular inspection assignments across the county, spending hours examining bridge joints, culverts, and retaining walls while the Homeowners Association continued transforming my gravel road into what they proudly called the future gateway to Willow Creek Estates. The smell of fresh asphalt lingered in the air every time I returned home, mixing with cut grass and damp cedar until the entire valley smelled more like a construction zone than a ranch. My neighbors assumed I had given up. Some even stopped by to offer sympathetic advice. One suggested I negotiate a payment plan with the Homeowners Association. Another quietly admitted the wider entrance actually looked attractive. I thanked each of them because none of this was really about appearances anymore. Every evening after dinner, I spread my grandfather's documents across the dining room table. Survey plats from the 1950s. Drainage calculations written in faded pencil. Maintenance logs kept by my father in neat block letters. County correspondence. Easement records. Inspection reports carrying official state seals. One by one, I organized every document into chronological order, scanning each page into digital copies while the soft hum of my desktop scanner filled the quiet house. Years of engineering had taught me something that every experienced inspector eventually learns. The strongest argument is usually the one that requires the fewest spoken words. On Thursday afternoon, I visited the county records office. The old courthouse smelled exactly the way it always had, with polished wood, aging paper, and fresh coffee drifting through long hallways lined with framed survey maps. Linda Mercer, the deputy records clerk, recognized me before I reached the counter. We had worked together on dozens of infrastructure projects over the years. She smiled warmly until I explained which property I was researching. Her expression changed immediately. The Homeowners Association requested copies of several subdivision maps last month, she said carefully. Did they request the drainage easement files too? I asked. She turned toward her computer, typed for nearly a minute, then slowly shook her head. No, only the subdivision plats. I nodded because that was exactly the answer I expected. They had studied property lines but ignored the infrastructure beneath them. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every recorded easement, maintenance agreement, and drainage exhibit connected to Whitaker Crossing. Linda returned carrying a stack of documents nearly 2 inches thick. Planning for court? She asked with a small smile. Not yet, I answered honestly. I am planning for accuracy. That evening, another light rain passed through Cedar Hollow. I parked near the damaged crossing after sunset and simply listened. Frogs called from the creek. Crickets filled the fields with steady rhythm. Beneath those familiar sounds came something else. Water slipping beneath loose fill instead of flowing cleanly through the original channel. I switched on my flashlight and watched tiny rivulets carving narrow paths beneath freshly compacted soil. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone driving by would ever notice. But erosion always begins as a whisper before it becomes an expensive conversation. I recorded photographs, measured the changing grade once again, and quietly saved every file with the date and exact time. When I finally drove home, my phone buzzed with a new electronic invoice from the Homeowners Association demanding immediate payment for reconstruction costs. I read it once, smiled to myself, and archived the message beside every other document. Some people collect evidence because they expect an argument. I collected it because eventually the truth always introduces itself. Monday morning began with clear skies, cool air, and the faint smell of wet limestone rising from the hills after the weekend showers. I arrived at my office before sunrise, unlocked the records room, and placed my leather folder beside the computer that had processed thousands of infrastructure reports over the last 2 decades. Outside, the maintenance yard slowly came to life as diesel engines warmed up and mechanics prepared inspection vehicles for another week. Inside, only the soft clicking of my keyboard disturbed the silence. I opened every scanned document one more time, not because I doubted the evidence, but because details matter when paperwork eventually reaches people whose signatures carry legal authority. The original survey matched the county easement. The maintenance agreements matched the inspection records. The drainage elevations matched the engineering drawings approved in 1958. Every single document pointed to the same conclusion. The crossing was never simply a private ranch road. It protected a regulated drainage corridor that carried stormwater away from a section of state highway less than 1 mile downstream. I leaned back in my chair and remembered something my first supervisor had told me during my training years. Most infrastructure failures do not begin with broken concrete. They begin with somebody assuming the rules apply to everyone else. That sentence had followed me throughout my career. Around mid-morning, I opened the State Department of Transportation reporting portal that every licensed inspector in the state knew well. It was not designed for neighborhood disputes. It existed for one purpose only: documenting unauthorized work that could affect regulated transportation infrastructure. I never exaggerated facts on official reports, and I certainly was not about to start now. I attached the certified survey maps. then the historical engineering drawings, then the maintenance records showing decades of state inspections. Next came my photographs documenting the original inspection stamp embedded in the removed culvert, followed by images comparing the previous drainage grade with the newly altered elevation. Finally, I uploaded measurements collected after the recent rainfall, demonstrating that runoff had already begun bypassing the intended flow path. I carefully avoided opinions. There was no need for dramatic language when mathematics spoke clearly enough. The final page contained only one sentence in the narrative section. Recent construction appears to have modified a protected drainage crossing without corresponding permit documentation located in county or state records. I reviewed everything twice before pressing the submission button. The entire process took less than 15 minutes. No attorney, no courtroom, no confrontation, just evidence delivered through the system designed to receive it. After work, I stopped by the ranch on my way home. Construction crews were planting decorative shrubs beside the widened entrance while Miranda stood with a photographer taking promotional pictures for the Homeowners Association newsletter. She noticed my truck and walked over with complete confidence. "I was beginning to think you finally accepted reality," she said with an amused smile. I looked beyond her toward the fresh pavement shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. "Reality has a way of introducing itself when people stop ignoring records," I answered. She laughed politely, assuming I meant another lawsuit she expected to win. I simply nodded, climbed back into my truck, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could still see workers laying sod over disturbed ground, carefully covering every visible trace of what had been changed beneath the surface. They believed landscaping finished the project. I knew paperwork had only just begun. 3 days passed without a single phone call, email, or certified letter from the state, and that silence was exactly what I expected. Government agencies rarely moved fast, but they almost always moved deliberately. Meanwhile, life inside Willow Creek Estates carried on as though the project had already become another success story. Decorative banners appeared along the new entrance announcing a grand reopening celebration. Fresh mulch covered every flower bed. Young maple trees stood perfectly spaced along the shoulder, and crews polished the stone monuments until they reflected the afternoon sunlight. Anyone driving through would have admired the neighborhood, without realizing the most important part of the project was buried several feet beneath their tires. On Friday afternoon, I returned home from inspecting a rural bridge nearly 60 miles away. The familiar smell of warm pine mixed with fresh-cut grass drifted across the ranch as I turned into my driveway. Before I even shut off the engine, I noticed 2 unfamiliar white sport utility vehicles parked beside the damaged crossing. Neither displayed emergency lights. Neither carried flashy markings. They looked exactly like the countless fleet vehicles used by state field inspectors across Texas. 2 men and 1 woman wearing reflective safety vests stood quietly near the culvert with clipboards, laser measuring equipment, and survey rods. They were not speaking with Miranda. They were not speaking with contractors. They were simply measuring. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching the scene unfold through my windshield. Experienced inspectors share a certain rhythm. Nobody wastes words because measurements eventually speak louder than opinions. One inspector crouched beside the exposed drainage channel, another compared elevations using a digital level, while the third photographed every section of the reconstructed crossing from multiple angles. Miranda finally noticed them and hurried across the pavement carrying a thick binder filled with project renderings. Even from 50 yards away, I could recognize the confident smile she reserved for situations she believed she controlled. She greeted them enthusiastically, pointing toward the decorative sidewalks and newly landscaped entrance while speaking with animated gestures. None of the inspectors looked at the flower beds. None of them examined the stone columns. Instead, one politely accepted her documents, flipped through several pages, and asked what appeared to be a very short question. Miranda paused. Her smile faded slightly. She searched through the binder, turned several pages, then looked toward one of the contractors. Within minutes, 3 more people had gathered around the open binder, each flipping through paperwork with growing urgency. The inspectors remained remarkably calm. They simply continued taking measurements while occasionally writing notes on standardized forms. I never left my truck. There was nothing useful I could add. Everything they needed had already been submitted days earlier. About an hour later, one of the inspectors walked toward my driveway. He introduced himself, thanked me for the documentation, and asked whether the original survey monuments still existed beyond the construction limits. I showed him the remaining markers my grandfather had installed decades ago. He compared their coordinates with the certified survey in his tablet computer, nodded once, and quietly said, "They match exactly." That was all. No dramatic announcement. No accusations. No raised voices. As the sun settled lower behind the hills, the inspection team packed away their equipment and drove off without offering anyone an opinion about what they had found. Miranda stood beside the entrance watching them disappear down the county road, still holding the same binder that had looked so impressive only an hour earlier. For the first time since this whole mess had started, she was no longer smiling. The official letter arrived the following Wednesday, just after 9:00 in the morning, tucked inside a plain overnight envelope with the State Department of Transportation seal printed across the upper left corner. It did not look dramatic. No bright warning colors. No oversized stamps. Just a clean government envelope carrying the quiet weight that only official paperwork seems to have. I signed for it, thanked the delivery driver, and carried it inside while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. I already knew the inspection team had finished their review. What I did not know was how far the findings had gone. The report itself stretched nearly 40 pages. Every photograph I had submitted appeared beside measurements independently verified by the state inspection team. The altered drainage elevations matched my field notes within fractions of an inch. The removed culvert had been identified through its original inspection number. Historical maintenance records confirmed continuous state oversight dating back more than 6 decades. Most importantly, investigators concluded that construction had modified protected drainage infrastructure without the permits required for work affecting state transportation facilities. The final pages outlined the required corrective actions. Every unauthorized improvement within the regulated corridor had to be removed. The drainage system had to be restored to its original engineering specifications. Independent environmental monitoring would remain in place throughout reconstruction. New hydraulic studies would verify proper stormwater performance before final acceptance. All engineering reviews, contractor expenses, material replacement, environmental compliance, traffic management, and inspection costs would be billed to the responsible parties. I quietly set the report on the kitchen table and looked out the window toward the hills where sunlight reflected across the freshly paved entrance. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Linda Mercer from the county records office. Her voice carried the careful professionalism of someone trying very hard not to sound surprised. "Cole," she said, "you might want to drive past the subdivision this afternoon." She would not say anything more. By the time I reached the entrance, 3 additional state vehicles had already arrived. Temporary traffic signs redirected vehicles away from the reconstructed crossing, while survey crews placed bright orange stakes along both shoulders. Contractors who had been planting decorative landscaping only days earlier now stood quietly beside their equipment waiting for instructions. Miranda stood near the stone entrance monument speaking with 2 attorneys and several members of the Homeowners Association board. Even from across the road, I could see the confidence that had defined every previous conversation had completely disappeared. One state representative handed her a thick binder along with a formal acknowledgement receipt requiring a signature. She read the first few pages, stopped, looked back at the roadway, then slowly continued reading. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. There was simply too much documentation for disagreement to accomplish anything. A local reporter arrived before sunset after hearing about the state enforcement action. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalks whispering to one another while contractors quietly removed equipment from the work zone. Before leaving, one of the inspectors fastened a temporary notice to the construction fence identifying the project as an unauthorized modification under state review. A week later, the financial responsibility assessment became public. Engineering redesign, roadway restoration, drainage reconstruction, environmental compliance, inspection services, traffic control, and administrative recovery totaled $3,041,882.63. It was not described as a punishment. It was simply the documented cost of restoring infrastructure that should never have been altered in the first place. For the first time since the machines arrived, the only sound echoing through Cedar Hollow was the steady breeze moving across the untouched fields. By the time autumn settled over Cedar Hollow, the construction noise had disappeared completely. The smell of fresh asphalt was gone, replaced once again by damp cedar, wild grass, and the cool morning air that had always drifted across the valley before sunrise. I drove my old Ford F-250 toward the crossing one quiet Saturday morning, rolling down the window just enough to hear the tires crunch across gravel again. That familiar sound had been missing for months. Most people would never understand why I smiled at something as ordinary as gravel beneath truck tires, but to me it sounded like history finally breathing again. The temporary barricades had long since disappeared. The decorative entrance monuments were gone. The oversized boulevard plans had been abandoned before they were ever completed. In their place stood a restored drainage crossing built almost exactly as the original engineering drawings specified decades earlier. The new stonework blended so naturally with the landscape that someone passing through for the first time would probably assume it had always been there. That is the funny thing about good engineering. When it is done correctly, nobody notices it. They only notice when somebody decides to ignore it. The Homeowners Association board looked very different now. Miranda Holloway resigned only weeks after the state completed its enforcement process. Several other board members stepped down during the following election, replaced by homeowners who seemed more interested in reading governing documents than creating new rules. The monthly meetings became noticeably quieter. Discussions shifted from expensive cosmetic projects toward practical maintenance, budgets, and long-term planning. For the first time in years, neighbors started talking to one another instead of talking about one another. A few even stopped by the ranch to apologize for assuming I had simply refused to cooperate with community improvements. I never blamed them. They had only seen polished presentations and attractive renderings. They had never seen the engineering records, the easement documents, or the inspection reports quietly sitting inside county archives for more than 60 years. One afternoon, I found the construction supervisor who had quietly asked me about the original drawings weeks before everything changed. He shook my hand and admitted he had suspected something was wrong the moment nobody could produce permit records for the drainage crossing. I have learned something from all this, he told me. Never build first and ask questions later. I smiled because that lesson had cost someone else far more than it ever should have. Sometimes people ask whether I enjoyed watching the Homeowners Association receive that enormous financial assessment. The truth usually surprises them. I never wanted anyone to lose millions of dollars. I never wanted neighbors divided. I never wanted years of unnecessary reconstruction. All I wanted was for people to respect the work that generations before us had already completed with patience, experience, and careful planning. My grandfather used to say that every road carries two stories. One is the story people see on the surface. The other is hidden beneath their tires where foundations, drainage, and quiet engineering do their jobs without asking for recognition. Most people only remember the smooth pavement. Engineers remember everything underneath it. As I crossed Whitaker Crossing one last time that evening, I glanced toward the restored culvert where clear water flowed exactly where it had been designed to flow all those years ago. I realized the road had never needed me to rebuild it. It only needed someone willing to remember why it had been built correctly in the first place. Because justice is rarely loud, but like good infrastructure, it lasts far longer than the people who underestimate it.